Don't forget to subscribe. Afterwards, the wisest and most spiritual books from the greatest authors await you every day. And now buckle up, sit back and we'll begin. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. From the caves and jungles of Hindostan. The city of the dead. What would be your choice if you had to choose between being blind and being deaf? 9 people out of 10 answer this question by positively preferring deafness to blindness. And one whose good fortune it has been to contemplate, even for a moment, some fantastic fairy-like corner of India, this country of lace-like marble palaces and enchanting gardens, would willingly add to deafness, lameness of both legs, rather than lose such sights. We are told that Sati, the great poet, bitterly complained of his friends looking tired and indifferent, while he praised the beauty and charm of his lady love. If the happiness of contemplating her wonderful beauty, remonstrated he, was yours, as it is mine, you could not fail to understand my verses, which, alas, describe in such meager and inadequate terms the rapturous feelings experienced by everyone who sees her even from a distance. I fully sympathize with the enamored poet, but cannot condemn his friends who never saw his lady love. And that is why I tremble lest my constant rhapsodies on India should bore my readers as much as Sati bored his friends. But what, I pray you, is the poor narrator to do when new, undreamed of charms are daily discovered in the lady love in question? Her darkest aspects, abject and immoral as they are, and sometimes of such a nature as to excite your horror, even these aspects are full of some wild poetry, of originality, which cannot be met with in any other country. It is not unusual for a European novice to shudder with disgust at some features of local everyday life, but at the same time these very sights attract and fascinate the attention like a horrible nightmare. We had plenty of these experiences whilst our école buissonnière lasted. We spent these days far from railways and from any other vestige of civilization. Happily so, because European civilization does not suit India any better than a fashionable bonnet would suit a half-naked Peruvian maiden, a true daughter of Sun, of Cortez's time. All the day long we wandered across rivers and jungles, passing villages and ruins of ancient fortresses, over local board roads between Nasik and Jublapur, traveling with the aid of bullock cars, elephants, horses, and very often being carried in pawks. At nightfall we put up our tents and slept anywhere. These days offered us an opportunity of seeing that man decidedly can surmount trying and even dangerous conditions of climate, though, perhaps, in a passive way, by mere force of habit. In the afternoons, when we, white people, were very nearly fainting with the roasting heat, in spite of thick cork tapas and such shelter as we could procure, and even our native companions had to use more than the usual supplies of muslin round their heads, the Bengali babu traveled on horseback endless miles, under the vertical rays of the hot sun, bareheaded, protected only by his thick crop of hair. The sun has no influence whatever on Bengali skulls. They are covered only on solemn occasions, in cases of weddings and great festivities. Their turbans are useless adornments, like flowers in a European lady's hair. Bengali babus are born clerks, they invade all railroad stations, post and telegraph offices and government law courts. Wrapped in their white muslin toga virilis, their legs bare up to the knees, their heads unprotected, they proudly loaf on the platforms of railway stations or at the entrances of their offices, casting contemptuous glances on the Marathas, who dearly love their numerous rings and lovely earrings in the upper part of their right ears. Bengalis, unlike the rest of the Hindus, do not paint sectarian signs on their foreheads. The only trinket they do not completely despise is an expensive necklace, but even this is not common. Contrary to all expectations, the Marathas, with all their little effeminate ways, are the bravest tribe of India, gallant and experienced soldiers, a fact which has been demonstrated by centuries of fighting. But Bengal has never as yet produced a single soldier out of its 65 million inhabitants. Not a single Bengali is to be found in the native regiments of the British Army. This is a strange fact, which I refused to believe at first, but which has been confirmed by many English officers and by Bengalis themselves. But with all this, they are far from being cowardly. Their wealthy classes do lead a somewhat effeminate life, but their zamindars and peasantry are undoubtedly brave. Disarmed by their present government, the Bengali peasants go out to meet the tiger, which in their country is more ferocious than elsewhere, armed only with a club, as composedly as they used to go with rifles and swords. Many out-of-the-way paths and groves which most probably had never before been trodden by a European foot were visited by us during these short days. Gulab Lal Singh was absent, but we were accompanied by a trusted servant of his, and the welcome we met with almost everywhere was certainly the result of the magic influence of his name. If the wretched, naked peasants shrank from us and shut their doors at our approach, the Brahmins were as obliging as could be desired. The sights around Khandesh, on the way to Thalner and Mao, are very picturesque. But the effect is not entirely due to nature's beauty. Art has a good deal to do with it, especially in Mussulman cemeteries. Now they are all more or less destroyed and deserted, owing to the increase of the Hindu inhabitants around them, and to the Mussulman princes, once the rightful lords of India, being expelled. Mussulmans of the present day are badly off and have to put up with more humiliations than even the Hindus. But still they have left many memorials behind them, and, amongst others, their cemeteries. The Mussulman fidelity to the dead is a very touching feature of their character. Their devotion to those that are gone is always more demonstrative than their affection for the living members of their families, and almost entirely concentrates itself on their last abodes. In proportion as their notions of paradise are coarse and material, the appearance of their cemeteries is poetical, especially in India. One may pleasantly spend whole hours in these shady, delightful gardens, amongst their white monuments crowned with turbans, covered with roses and jessamine, and sheltered with rows of cypresses. We often stopped in such places to sleep and dine. A cemetery near Thalner is especially attractive. Out of several mausoleums in a good state of preservation, the most magnificent is the monument of the family of Collator, who was hanged on the city tower by the order of General Hislop in 1818. 4 other mausoleums attracted our attention, and we learned that one of them is celebrated throughout India. It is a white marble octagon, covered from top to bottom with carving, the like of which could not be found even in Pir Lachaise. A Persian inscription on its base records that it cost 100,000 rupees. By day, bathed in the hot rays of the sun, its tall minaret-like outline looks like a block of ice against a blue sky. By night, with the aid of the intense phosphorescent moonlight proper to India, it is still more dazzling and poetical. The summit looks as if it were covered with freshly fallen snow crystals. Raising its slender profile above the dark background of bushes, it suggests some pure midnight apparition, soaring over the silent abode of destruction and lamenting what will never return. Side by side with these cemeteries rise the Hindu Ghats, generally by the river bank. There really is something grand in the ritual of burning the dead. Witnessing this ceremony, the spectator is struck with the deep philosophy underlying the fundamental idea of this custom. In the course of an hour, nothing remains of the body but a few handfuls of ashes. A professional Brahmin, like a priest of death, scatters these ashes to the winds over a river. 5 B3G B340, B68 8GC2A B220, N188 equals 5 equals 02845 at 0420 AL 800, B081 at 07. A equals 2272 at 0I05 BAO, G5BK at 5M55 equals B055, B at 008 B0053, 2B5 G5 equals 85, AB 4 Lira 33, 2 at 55 equals 8887, B at 9 equals at A. 8 at 072820 L, 3 equals N. A82C, G8ABBK, B at K9BL, GB3B8, B5, GB1K4C, 3A2148 BLAO, B2A53, equals 5G8AB3888214 equals CAB at 58BLAO 2 equals 2CN, AD5 at CA5 at B equals 3ACI5AB220 equals 80, 345064K9, 3 at 5E0205 BAO 0 equals 5 at 5B. Equals 25 equals 80 equals 0 CB8 H5 88 15A equals 5G equals 51065 equals AB2 74 CEC B at K9 equals 024 KE008 ILN B at 368 0 845 B at 0 OG8 AB80 55 D878 G5A8, 84 C2 equals 8 B55 at 4 Lira 6 equals 0 at 8 equals OBL 5355, 2825 G8 AB5 equals dot. The adjective pure must be understood in the figurative sense of the mantram. Generally speaking, the rivers of India, beginning with the thrice sacred Ganges, are dreadfully dirty, especially near villages and towns. In these rivers about 200 millions of people daily cleanse themselves from the tropical perspiration and dirt. The corpses of those who are not worth burning are thrown in the same rivers, and their number is great, because it includes all Shudras, pariahs, and various other outcasts, as well as Brahmin children under 3 years of age. Only rich and high-born people are buried pompously. It is for them that the sandalwood fires are lit after sunset, it is for them that mantrams are chanted, and for them that the gods are invoked. But Shudras must not listen on any account to the divine words dictated at the beginning of the world by the 4 rishis to Veda Vyasa, the great theologian of Aryavarta. No fires for them, no prayers. As during his life a Shudra never approaches a temple nearer than 7 steps, so even after death, he cannot be put on the same level with the twice-born. Brightly burn the fires, extending like a fiery serpent along the river. The dark outlines of strange, wildly fantastical figures silently move amongst the flames. Sometimes they raise their arms towards the sky, as if in a prayer, sometimes they add fuel to the fires, and poke them with long iron pitchforks. The dying flames rise high, creeping and dancing, sputtering with melted human fat and shooting towards the sky whole showers of golden sparks, which are instantly lost in the clouds of black smoke. This on the right side of the river. Let us now see what is going on the left. In the early hours of the morning, when the red fires, the black clouds of miasmas, and the thin figures of the fakirs grow dim and vanish little by little, when the smell of burnt flesh is blown away by the fresh wind which rises at the approach of the dawn, when, in a word, the right side of the river with its gotas plunges into stillness and silence, to be reawakened when the evening comes. Processions of a different kind appear on the left bank. We see groups of Hindu men and women in sad, silent trains. They approach the river quietly. They do not cry and have no rituals to perform. We see two men carrying something long and thin, wrapped in an old red rug. Holding it by the head and feet, they swing it into the dirty, yellowish waves of the river. The shock is so violent that the red rug flies open, and we behold the face of a young woman tinged with dark green, who quickly disappears in the river. Further on, another group, an old man and two young women. One of them, a little girl of 10, small, thin, hardly fully developed, sobs bitterly. She is the mother of a stillborn child, whose body is to be thrown in the river. Her weak voice monotonously resounds over the shore, and her trembling hands are not strong enough to lift the poor little corpse that is more like a tiny brown kitten than a human being. The old man tries to console her and, taking the body in his own hands, enters the water and throws it right in the middle. After him both the women get into the river and, having plunged 7 times to purify themselves from the touch of a dead body, they return home, their clothes dripping with wet. In the meanwhile, vultures, crows and other birds of prey gather in thick clouds and considerably retard the progress of the bodies down the river. Occasionally some half-stripped skeleton is caught by the reeds and stranded there helplessly for weeks, until an outcast, whose sad duty it is to busy himself all his life long with such unclean work, takes notice of it, and catching it by the ribs with his long hook, restores it to its highway towards the ocean. But let us leave the river bank, which is unbearably hot in spite of the early hour. Let us bid goodbye to the watery cemetery of the poor. Disgusting and heart-rending are such sights in the eyes of a European, and unconsciously we allow the light wings of reverie to transport us to the far north, to the peaceful village cemeteries where there are no marble monuments crowned with turbans, no sandalwood fires, no dirty rivers to serve the purpose of a last resting place, but where humble wooden crosses stand in rows, sheltered by old birches. How peacefully our dead repose under the rich green grass. None of them ever saw these gigantic palms, sumptuous palaces and pagodas covered with gold. But on their poor graves grow violets and lilies of the valley, and in the spring evenings nightingales sing to them in the old birch trees. No nightingales ever sing for me, either in the neighboring groves or in my own heart. The latter least of all. Let us stroll along this wall of reddish stone. It will lead us to a fortress once celebrated and drenched with blood, now harmless and half-ruined, like many another Indian fortress. Flocks of green parrots, startled by our approach, fly from under every cavity of the old wall, their wings shining in the sun like so many flying emeralds. This territory is accursed by Englishmen. This is Chandvad, where, during the Sepoy Mutiny, The bills streamed from their ambuscades like a mighty mountain torrent and cut many an English throat. Tattva, an ancient Hindu book treating of the geography of the times of King Asoka, 250–300 BC, teaches us that the Marathi territory spreads up to the wall of Chandvad or Chandar, and that the Khandish country begins on the other side of the river. But English people do not believe in Tattva or in any other authority, and want us to learn that Khandish begins right at the foot of Chandar hillocks. 12 miles southeast from Chandvad there is a whole town of subterranean temples, known under the name of Enke Tenke. Here, again, the entrance is 100 feet from the base, and the hill is pyramidal. I must not attempt to give a full description of these temples, as this subject must be worked out in a way quite impossible in a newspaper article. So I shall only note that here all the statues, idols, and carvings are ascribed to Buddhist ascetics of the first centuries after the death of Buddha. I wish I could content myself with this statement. But, unfortunately, Messieurs les archéologues meet here with an unexpected difficulty, and a more serious one than all the difficulties brought on them by the inconsistencies of all other temples put together. In these temples there are more idols designated Buddhas than anywhere else. They cover the main entrance, sit in thick rows along the balconies, occupy the inner walls of the cells, watch the entrances of all the doors like monster giants, and 2 of them sit in the chief tank, where spring water washes them century after century without any harm to their granite bodies. Some of these Buddhas are decently clad, with pyramidal pagodas as their headgear, others are naked, some sit, others stand, some are real colossi, some tiny, some of middle size. However, all this would not matter. We may go so far as to overlook the fact of Gautama's or Siddhartha Buddha's reform, consisting precisely in his earnest desire to tear up by the roots the Brahmanical idol worship. Though, of course, we cannot help remembering that his religion remained pure from idol worship of any kind during centuries, until the Lamas of Tibet, the Chinese, the Burmese, and the Siamese taking it into their lands disfigured it and spoilt it with heresies. We cannot forget that, persecuted by conquering Brahmins and expelled from India, it found, at last, a shelter in Ceylon where it still flourishes like the legendary aloe, which is said to blossom once in its lifetime and then to die, as the root is killed by the exuberance of blossom, and the seeds cannot produce anything but weeds. All this we may overlook, as I said before. But the difficulty of the archaeologist still exists, if not in the fact of idols being ascribed to early Buddhists, then in the physiognomies, in the type of all these Enke Tenke Buddhas. They all, from the tiniest to the hugest, are Negroes, with flat noses, thick lips, 45 degrees of the facial angle, and curly hair. There is not the slightest likeness between these Negro faces and any of the Siamese or Tibetan Buddhas, which all have purely Mongolian features and perfectly straight hair. This unexpected African type, unheard of in India, upsets the antiquarians entirely. This is why the archaeologists avoid mentioning these caves. Enke Tenke is a worse difficulty for them than even Nasik. They find it as hard to conquer as the Persians found Thermopylae. We passed by Malaganva and Chakalval, where we examined an exceedingly curious ancient temple of the Jainas. No cement was used in the building of its outer walls. They consist entirely of square stones, which are so well wrought and so closely joined that the blade of the thinnest knife cannot be pushed between 2 of them. The interior of the temple is richly decorated. On our way back we did not stop in Thalner, but went straight on to Gara. There we had to hire elephants again to visit the splendid ruins of Mandu, once a strongly fortified town, about 20 miles due northeast of this place. This time we got there speedily and safely. I mention this place because some time later I witnessed in its vicinity a most curious sight, offered by the branch of the numerous Indian rites, which is generally called devil worship. Mandu is situated on the ridge of the Vindhya Mountains, about 2,000 feet above the surface of the sea. According to Malcolm's statement, this town was built in AD 313 and for a long time was the capital of the Hindu Rajas of Dara. The historian Farishta points to Mandu as the residence of Dilavan Khan Guri, the first king of Malwa, who flourished in 1387–1405. In 1526 the town was taken by Bahadur Shah, king of Gujarat, but in 1570 Akbar won this town back, and a marble slab over the town gate still bears his name and the date of his visit. On entering this vast city in its present state of solitude, the natives call it the Dead Town. We all experienced a peculiar feeling, not unlike the sensation of a man who enters Pompeii for the first time. Everything shows that Mandu was once one of the wealthiest towns of India. The town wall is 37 miles long. Streets ran whole miles, on their sides stand ruined palaces, and marble pillars lie on the ground. Black excavations of the subterranean halls, in the coolness of which rich ladies spent the hottest hours of the day, peer from under dilapidated granite walls. Further on are broken stairs, dry tanks, waterless fountains, endless empty yards, marble platforms, and disfigured arches of majestic porches. All this is overgrown with creepers and shrubs, hiding the dens of wild beasts. Here and there a well-preserved wall of some palace rises high above the general wreck, its empty windows fringed with parasitic plants blinking and staring at us like sightless eyes, protesting against troublesome intruders. And still further, in the very center of the ruins, the heart of the dead town sends forth a whole crop of broken cypresses, an untrimmed grove on the place where heaved once so many breasts and clamored so many passions. In 1570 this town was called Shadayabad, the abode of happiness. The Franciscan missionaries, Adolphe Acquaviva, Antonio de Monserrate, and others, who came here in that very year as an embassy from Goa to seek various privileges from the Mughal government, described it over and over again. At this epoch it was one of the greatest cities of the world, whose magnificent streets and luxurious ways used to astonish the most pompous courts of India. It seems almost incredible that in such a short period, nothing should remain of this town but the heaps of rubbish, amongst which we could hardly find room enough for our tent. At last we decided to pitch it in the only building which remained in a tolerable state of preservation, in Jami Masjid, the cathedral mosque, on a granite platform about 25 steps higher than the square. The stairs, constructed of pure marble like the greater part of the town buildings, are broad and almost untouched by time, but the roof has entirely disappeared, and so we were obliged to put up with the stars for a canopy. All round this building runs a low gallery supported by several rows of thick pillars. From a distance it reminds one, in spite of its being somewhat clumsy and lacking in proportion, of the Acropolis of Athens. From the stairs, where we rested for a while, there was a view of the mausoleum of Dashanga Guri, king of Malwa, in whose reign the town was at the culmination of its brilliancy and glory. It is a massive, majestic, white marble edifice with a sheltered peristyle and finely carved pillars. This peristyle once led straight to the palace, but now it is surrounded with a deep ravine, full of broken stones and overgrown with cacti. The interior of the mausoleum is covered with golden lettering of inscriptions from the Quran, and the sarcophagus of the Sultan is placed in the middle. Close by it stands the palace of Baz Bahadur, all broken to pieces, nothing now but a heap of dust covered with trees. We spent the whole day visiting these sad remains and returned to our sheltering place a little before sunset, exhausted with hunger and thirst, but triumphantly carrying on our sticks 3 huge snakes, killed on our way home. Tea and supper were waiting for us. To our great astonishment, we found visitors in the tent. The patel of the neighboring village, something between a tax collector and a judge, and 2 zamindars, landowners, rode over to present us their respects and to invite us and our Hindu friends, some of whom they had known previously, to accompany them to their houses. On hearing that we intended to spend the night in the dead town, they grew awfully indignant. They assured us it was highly dangerous and utterly impossible. 2 hours later, hyenas, tigers, and other beasts of prey were sure to come out from under every bush and every ruined wall, without mentioning thousands of jackals and wild cats. Our elephants would not stay, and if they did stay, no doubt they would be devoured. We ought to leave the ruins as quickly as possible and go with them to the nearest village, which would not take us more than half an hour. In the village everything had been prepared for us, and our friend the Babu was already there and getting impatient at our delay. Only on hearing this did we become aware that our bareheaded and cautious friend was conspicuous by his absence. Probably he had left some time ago, without consulting us, and made straight to the village where he evidently had friends. Sending for us was a mere trick of his. But the evening was so sweet, and we felt so comfortable, that the idea of upsetting all our plans for the morning was not at all attractive. Besides, it seemed quite ridiculous to think that the ruins, amongst which we had wandered several hours without meeting anything more dangerous than a snake, swarmed with wild animals. So we smiled and returned thanks, but would not accept the invitation. "But you positively must not dare to stay here," insisted the fat Patel. "In case of accident, I shall be responsible for you to the government. Is it possible you do not dread a sleepless night spent in fighting jackals, if not something worse? You do not believe that you are surrounded with wild animals. It is true they are invisible until sunset, but nevertheless they are dangerous. If you do not believe us, believe the instinct of your elephants, who are as brave as you, but a little more reasonable. Just look at them." We looked. Truly, our grave, philosophic-looking elephants behaved very strangely at this moment. Their lifted trunks looked like huge points of interrogation. They snorted and stamped restively. In another minute one of them tore the thick rope with which he was tied to a broken pillar, made a sudden volte-face with all his heavy body, and stood against a wind, sniffing the air. Evidently he perceived some dangerous animal in the neighborhood. The colonel stared at him through his spectacles and whistled very meaningly. "Well, well," remarked he, "what shall we do if tigers really assault us? What shall we do indeed?" Was my thought. Thakur Gulab Lal Singh is not here to protect us. Our Hindu companions sat on the carpet after their oriental fashion, quietly chewing betel. On being asked their opinion, they said they would not interfere with our decision, and were ready to do exactly as we liked. But as for the European portion of our party, there was no use concealing the fact that we were frightened, and we speedily prepared to start. 5 minutes later we mounted the elephants, and, in a quarter of an hour, just when the sun disappeared behind the mountain and heavy darkness instantaneously fell, we passed the gate of Akbar and descended into the valley. We were hardly a quarter of a mile from our abandoned camping place when the cypress grove resounded with shrieking howls of jackals, followed by a well-known mighty roar. There was no longer any possibility of doubting. The tigers were disappointed at our escape. Their discontentment shook the very air, and cold perspiration stood on our brows. Our elephants sprang forward, upsetting the order of our procession and threatening to crush the horses and their riders before us. We ourselves, however, were out of danger. We sat in a strong howdah, locked as in a dungeon. It is useless to deny that we have had a narrow escape, remarked the colonel, looking out of the window at some 20 servants of the Patel, who were busily lighting torches. Brahmanic hospitalities. In an hour's time we stopped at the gate of a large bungalow and were welcomed by the beaming face of our bareheaded Bengali. When we were all safely gathered on the veranda, he explained to us that, knowing beforehand that our American pigheadedness would not listen to any warning, he had dodged up this little scheme of his own and was very glad he had been successful. Now let us go and wash our hands, and then to supper. And, he added, addressing me, was it not your wish to be present at a real Hindu meal? This is your opportunity. Our host is a Brahmin, and you are the first Europeans who ever entered the part of his house inhabited by the family. Who amongst Europeans ever dreamed of a country where every step and the least action of everyday life, especially of the family life, is controlled by religious rites and cannot be performed except according to a certain program? India is this country. In India, all the important incidents of a man's life, such as birth, reaching certain periods of a child's life, marriage, fatherhood, old age and death, as well as all the physical and physiological functions of everyday routine, like morning ablutions, dressing, eating, et tout ce qui s'ensuit, from a man's first hour to his last sigh, everything must be performed according to a certain Brahmanical ritual, on penalty of expulsion from his caste. The Brahmins may be compared to the musicians of an orchestra in which the different musical instruments are the numerous sects of their country. They are all of a different shape and of a different timbre, but still every one of them obeys the same leader of the band. However widely the sects may differ in the interpretation of their sacred books, however hostile they may be to each other, striving to put forward their particular deity, every one of them, obeying blindly the ancient custom, must follow like musicians the same directing wand, the laws of Manu. This is the point where they all meet and form a unanimous, single-minded community, a strongly united mass. And woe to the one who breaks the symphony by a single discordant note. The elders and the caste or sub-caste councils, of these there are any number, whose members hold office for life, are stern rulers. There is no appeal against their decisions, and this is why expulsion from the caste is a calamity, entailing truly formidable consequences. The excommunicated member is worse off than a leper, the solidarity of the castes in this respect being something phenomenal. The only thing that can bear any comparison with it is the solidarity of the disciples of Loyola. If members of two different castes, united by the sincerest feelings of respect and friendship, may not intermarry, may not dine together, are forbidden to accept a glass of water from each other, or to offer each other a hookah, it becomes clear how much more severe all these restrictions must be in the case of an excommunicated person. The poor wretch must literally die to everybody, to the members of his own family as to strangers. His own household, his father, wife, children, are all bound to turn their faces from him, under the penalty of being excommunicated in their turn. There is no hope for his sons and daughters of getting married, however innocent they may be of the sin of their father. From the moment of excommunication, the Hindu must totally disappear. His mother and wife must not feed him, must not let him drink from the family well. No member of any existing caste dares to sell him his food or cook for him. He must either starve or buy eatables from outcasts and Europeans, and so incur the dangers of further pollution. When the Brahmanical power was at its zenith, such acts as deceiving, robbing and even killing this wretch were encouraged, as he was beyond the pale of the laws. Now, at all events, he is free from the latter danger, but still, even now, if he happens to die before he is forgiven and received back into his caste, his body may not be burned, and no purifying mantrams will be chanted for him. He will be thrown into the water, or left to rot under the bushes like a dead cat. This is a passive force, and its passiveness only makes it more formidable. Western education and English influence can do nothing to change it. There exists only one course of action for the excommunicated. He must show signs of repentance and submit to all kinds of humiliations, often to the total loss of all his worldly possessions. Personally, I know several young Brahmins who, having brilliantly passed the university examinations in England, have had to submit to the most repulsive conditions of purification on their return home, these purifications consisting chiefly in shaving off half their mustaches and eyebrows, crawling in the dust round pagodas, clinging during long hours to the tail of a sacred cow, and, finally, swallowing the excrements of this cow. The latter ceremony is called Panchagavya, literally, the 5 products of the cow: milk, curds, butter, etc. The voyage over Kalapani, the black water, that is to say the sea, is considered the worst of all the sins. A man who commits it is considered as polluting himself continually, from the first moment of his going on board the Balati, foreign, ship. Only a few days ago a friend of ours, who is an LL.D, had to undergo this purgation, and it nearly cost him his reason. When we remonstrated with him, pointing out that in his case it was simply foolish to submit, he being a materialist by conviction and not caring a straw for Brahmanism, he replied that he was bound to do so for the following reasons. I have 2 daughters, he explained, one 5, the other 6 years old. If I do not find a husband for the eldest of them in the course of the coming year, she will grow too old to get married, nobody will think of espousing her. Suppose I suffer my caste to excommunicate me, both my girls will be dishonored and miserable for the rest of their lives. Then, again, I must take into consideration the superstitions of my old mother. If such a misfortune befell me, it would simply kill her. But why should he not free himself from every bond to Brahmanism and caste? Why not join, once for all, the ever-growing community of men who are guilty of the same offense? Why not ask all his family to form a colony and join the civilization of the Europeans? All these are very natural questions, but unfortunately there is no difficulty in finding reasons for answering them in the negative. There were 32 reasons given why one of Napoleon's marshals refused to besiege a certain fortress, but the first of these reasons was the absence of gunpowder, and so it excluded the necessity of discussing the remaining 31. Similarly, the first reason why a Hindu cannot be Europeanized is quite sufficient and does not call for any additional ones. This reason is that by doing so a Hindu would not improve his position. Were he such an adept of science as to rival Tyndall, were he such a clever politician as to eclipse the genius of Disraeli and Bismarck, as soon as he actually had given up his caste and kinsmen, he would indubitably find himself in the position of Mahomet's coffin. Metaphorically speaking, he would hang halfway between the earth and the sky. It would be an utter injustice to suppose that this state of things is the result of the policy of the English government, that the said government is afraid of giving a chance to natives who may be suspected of being hostile to the British rule. In reality, the government has little or nothing to do with it. This state of things must be attributed entirely to the social ostracism, to the contempt felt by a superior for an inferior race, a contempt deeply rooted in some members of the Anglo-Indian society and displayed at the least provocation. This question of racial superiority and inferiority plays a more important part than is generally believed, even in England. Nevertheless, the natives, Mussulmans included, do not deserve contempt, and so the gulf between the rulers and the ruled widens with every year, and long centuries would not suffice to fill it up. I have to dwell upon all this to give my readers a clear idea on the subject. And so it is no wonder the ill-fated Hindus prefer temporary humiliations and the physical and moral sufferings of the purification to the prospect of general contempt until death. These were the questions we discussed with the Brahmins during the 2 hours before dinner. Dining with foreigners and people belonging to different castes is, no doubt, a dangerous breach of Manu's sacred precepts. But this time, for once, it was easily explained. First, the stout Patel, our host, was the head of his caste, and so was beyond the dread of excommunication. Secondly, he had already taken all the prescribed and advisable precautions against being polluted by our presence. He was a free thinker in his own way, and a friend of Gulab Lal Singh, and so he rejoiced at the idea of showing us how much skillful sophistry and strategical circumspection can be used by adroit Brahmins to avoid the law in some circumstances, while adhering at the same time to its dead letter. Besides, our good-natured, well-favored host evidently desired to obtain a diploma from our society, being well aware that the collector of his district was enrolled amongst our members. These, at any rate, were the explanations of our Babu when we expressed our astonishment, so it was our concern to make the most of our chance and to thank Providence for this rare opportunity. And this we accordingly did. Hindus take their food only twice a day, at 10 o'clock in the morning and at 9 in the evening. Both meals are accompanied by complicated rites and ceremonies. Even very young children are not allowed to eat at odd times, eating without the prescribed performance of certain exorcisms being considered a sin. Thousands of educated Hindus have long ceased to believe in all these superstitious customs, but, nevertheless, they are daily practiced. Shamrao Bhayanathji, our host, belonged to the ancient caste of Patera Prabhas and was very proud of his origin. Prabhu means Lord, and this caste descends from the Kshatriyas. The first of them was Ashvapati, 700 BC. A lineal descendant of Rama and Prithu, who, as is stated in the local chronology, governed India in the Dvapara and Treta Yugas, which is a good while ago. The Patara Prabhas are the only caste within which Brahmins have to perform certain purely Vedic rites, known under the name of the Kshatriya rites. But this does not prevent their being Patans, instead of Patars, Patan meaning the fallen one. This is the fault of King Ashvapati. Once, when distributing gifts to holy anchorites, he inadvertently forgot to give his due to the great Brigu. The offended prophet and seer declared to him that his reign was drawing near its end, and that all his posterity would perish. The king, throwing himself on the ground, implored the prophet's pardon. But his curse had worked its fulfillment already. All that he could do to stop the mischief consisted in a solemn promise not to let the king's descendants disappear completely from the earth. However, the Patars soon lost their throne and their power. Since then they have had to live by their pens, in the employment of many successive governments, to exchange their name of Patars for Patans, and to lead a humbler life than many of their late subjects. Happily for our talkative amphitryon, his forefathers became Brahmins, that is to say went through the golden cow. The expression "to live by their pens" alludes, as we learned later on, to the fact of the Patans occupying all the small government posts in the Bombay Presidency, and so being dangerous rivals of the Bengali Babas since the time of British rule. In Bombay the Patan clerks reached the considerable figure of 5,000. Their complexion is darker than the complexion of Konkan Brahmins, but they are handsomer and brighter. As to the mysterious expression, "went through the golden cow," it illustrates a very curious custom. The Kshatriyas, and even the much despised Shudras, may become a sort of left-hand Brahmins. This metamorphosis depends on the will of the real Brahmins, who may, if they like, sell this right for several hundreds or thousands of cows. When the gift is accomplished, a model cow, made of pure gold, is erected and made sacred by the performance of some mystical ceremonies. The candidate must now crawl through her hollow body 3 times, and thus is transformed into a Brahmin. The present Maharaja of Travancore, and even the great Raja of Benares, who died recently, were both Shudras who acquired their rights in this manner. We received all this information and a notion of the legendary Patar Chronicle from our obliging host. Having announced that we must now get ready for dinner, he disappeared in the company of all the gentlemen of our party. Being left to ourselves, Miss X and I decided to have a good look at the house whilst it was empty. The Babu, being a downright modern Bengali, had no respect for the religious preparations for dinner and chose to accompany us, proposing to explain to us all that we should otherwise fail to understand. The Prabhu brothers always live together, but every married couple have separate rooms and servants of their own. The habitation of our host was very spacious. There were small several bungalows occupied by his brothers, and a chief building containing rooms for visitors, the general dining room, a lying-in ward, a small chapel with any number of idols, and so on. The ground floor, of course, was surrounded by a veranda pierced with arches leading to a huge hall. All round this hall were wooden pillars adorned with exquisite carving. For some reason or other, it struck me that these pillars once belonged to some palace of the dead town. On close examination I only grew more convinced that I was right. Their style bore no traces of Hindu taste, no gods, no fabulous monster animals, only arabesques and elegant leaves and flowers of non-existent plants. The pillars stood very close to each other, but the carvings prevented them from forming an uninterrupted wall, so that the ventilation was a little too strong. All the time we spent at the dinner table, miniature hurricanes whistled from behind every pillar, waking up all our old rheumatisms and toothaches, which had peacefully slumbered since our arrival in India. The front of the house was thickly covered with iron horseshoes, the best precaution against evil spirits and evil eyes. At the foot of a broad carved staircase we came across a couch or a cradle, hung from the ceiling by iron chains. I saw somebody lying on it, whom, at first sight, I mistook for a sleeping Hindu, and was going to retreat discreetly, but, recognizing my old friend Hanuman, I grew bold and endeavored to examine him. Alas! The poor idol possessed only a head and neck, the rest of his body was a heap of old rags. On the left side of the veranda there were many more lateral rooms, each with a special destination, some of which I have mentioned already. The largest of these rooms was called Vatan, and was used exclusively by the fair sex. Brahmin women are not bound to spend their lives under veils, like Muslim women, but still they have very little communication with men, and keep aloof. Women cook the men's food, but do not dine with them. The elder ladies of the family are often held in great respect, and husbands sometimes show a shy courteousness towards their wives, but still a woman has no right to speak to her husband before strangers, nor even before the nearest relations, such as her sisters and her mother. As to the Hindu widows, they really are the most wretched creatures in the whole world. As soon as a woman's husband dies, she must have her hair and her eyebrows shaven off. She must part with all her trinkets, her earrings, her nose jewels, her bangles and toe rings. After this is done, she is as good as dead. The lowest outcast would not marry her. A man is polluted by her slightest touch, and must immediately proceed to purify himself. The dirtiest work of the household is her duty, and she must not eat with the married women and the children. The sati, the burning of the widows, is abolished, but Brahmins are clever managers, and the widows often long for the sati. At last, having examined the family chapel, full of idols, flowers, rich vases with burning incense, lamps hanging from its ceiling, and aromatic herbs covering its floor, we decided to get ready for dinner. We carefully washed ourselves, but this was not enough. We were requested to take off our shoes. This was a somewhat disagreeable surprise, but a real Brahmanical supper was worth the trouble. However, a truly amazing surprise was still in store for us. On entering the dining room, we stopped short at the entrance. Both our European companions were dressed, or rather undressed, exactly like Hindus. For the sake of decency they kept on a kind of sleeveless knitted vest, but they were barefooted, wore the snow-white Hindu dudis, a piece of muslin wrapped round to the waist and forming a petticoat, and looked like something between white Hindus and Constantinople Gharkans de Bains. Both were indescribably funny. I never saw anything funnier. To the great discomfiture of the men, and the scandal of the grave ladies of the house, I could not restrain myself, but burst out laughing. Miss X blushed violently and followed my example. A quarter of an hour before the evening meal, every Hindu, old or young, has to perform a puja before the gods. He does not change his clothes, as we do in Europe, but takes off the few things he wore during the day. He bathes by the family well and loosens his hair, of which, if he is a Marathi or an inhabitant of the Deccan, He has only one long lock at the top of his shaven head. To cover the body and the head whilst eating would be sinful. Wrapping his waist and legs in a white silk duty, he goes once more to salute the idols, and then sits down to his meal. But here I shall allow myself to digress. Silk possesses the property of dismissing the evil spirits who inhabit the magnetic fluids of the atmosphere, says the Mantram, Book V, verse 23. And I cannot help wondering whether this apparent superstition may not contain a deeper meaning. It is difficult, I own, to part with our favorite theories about all the customs of ancient heathendom being mere ignorant superstitions. But of not some vague notions of these customs being founded originally on a true knowledge of scientific principles, found their way amongst European scientific circles? At first sight the idea seems untenable. But why may we not suppose that the ancients prescribed this observance in the full knowledge that the effect of electricity upon the organs of digestion is truly beneficial? People who have studied the ancient philosophy of India with a firm resolve to penetrate the hidden meaning of its aphorisms have for the most part grown convinced that electricity and its effects were known to a considerable extent to some philosophers, as, for instance, to Patanjali. Charaka and Sushruta had propounded the system of Hippocrates long before the time of him who in Europe is supposed to be the father of medicine. The Badrinath temple of Vishnu possesses a stone bearing evident proof of the fact that Surya Siddhanta knew and calculated the expansive force of steam many centuries ago. The ancient Hindus were the first to determine the velocity of light and the laws of its reflection, and the table of Pythagoras and his celebrated theorem of the square of hypotenuse are to be found in the ancient books of Jyotisha. All this leads us to suppose that ancient Aryans, when instituting the strange custom of wearing silk during meals, had something serious in view, more serious, at all events, than the dismissing of demons. Having entered the refectory, we immediately noticed what were the Hindu precautions against their being polluted by our presence. The stone floor of the hall was divided into 2 equal parts. This division consisted of a line traced in chalk, with cabalistic signs at either end. One part was destined for the host's party and the guests belonging to the same caste, the other for ourselves. On our side of the hall there was yet a 3rd square to contain Hindus of a different caste. The furniture of the 2 bigger squares was exactly similar. Along the 2 opposite walls, there were narrow carpets spread on the floor, covered with cushions and low stools. Before every occupant there was an oblong on the bare floor, traced also with chalk, and divided, like a chessboard, into small quadrangles which were destined for dishes and plates. Both the latter articles were made of the thick strong leaves of the Butea frondosa. Larger dishes of several leaves pinned together with thorns, plates and saucers of 1 leaf with its borders turned up. All the courses of the supper were already arranged on each square. We counted 48 dishes, containing about a mouthful of 48 different dainties. The materials of which they were composed were mostly terra incognita to us, but some of them tasted very nice. All this was vegetarian food. Of meat, fowl, eggs and fish there appeared no traces. There were chutneys, fruit and vegetables preserved in vinegar and honey, panchamrits, a mixture of pampello berries, tamarinds, cocoa milk, treacle and olive oil, and kushmir, made of radishes, honey and flour. There were also burning hot pickles and spices. All this was crowned with a mountain of exquisitely cooked rice and another mountain of chapatis, which are something like brown pancakes. The dishes stood in 4 rows, each row containing 12 dishes, and between the rows burned 3 aromatic sticks of the size of a small church taper. Our part of the hall was brightly lit with green and red candles. The chandeliers which held these candles were of a very queer shape. They each represented the trunk of a tree with a 7-headed cobra wound round it. From each of the 7 mouths rose a red or a green wax candle of spiral form like a corkscrew. Drafts blowing from behind every pillar fluttered the yellow flames, filling the roomy refectory with fantastic moving shadows and causing both our lightly clad gentlemen to sneeze very frequently. Leaving the dark silhouettes of the Hindus in comparative obscurity, this unsteady light made the 2 white figures still more conspicuous, as if making a masquerade of them and laughing at them. The relatives and friends of our host came in one after the other. They were all naked down to the waist, all barefooted, all wore the triple Brahmanical thread and white silk dudis, and their hair hung loose. Every sahib was followed by his own servant, who carried his cup, his silver, or even gold, jug filled with water, and his towel. All of them, having saluted the host, greeted us, the palms of their hands pressed together and touching their foreheads, their breasts, and then the floor. They all said to us, "Ram Ram and Namaste, salutation to thee," and then made straight for their respective seats in perfect silence. Their civilities reminded me that the custom of greeting each other with the twice pronounced name of some ancestor was usual in the remotest antiquity. We all sat down, the Hindus calm and stately, as if preparing for some mystic celebration, we ourselves feeling awkward and uneasy, fearing to prove guilty of some unpardonable blunder. An invisible choir of women's voices chanted a monotonous hymn, celebrating the glory of the gods. These were half a dozen Nautch girls from a neighboring pagoda. To this accompaniment we began satisfying our appetites. Thanks to the Babu's instructions, we took great care to eat only with our right hands. This was somewhat difficult because we were hungry and hasty, but quite necessary. Had we only so much as touched the rice with our left hands, whole hosts of Rakshasas, demons, would have been attracted to take part in the festivity that very moment, which, of course, would send all the Hindus out of the room. It is hardly necessary to say that there were no traces of forks, knives or spoons. That I might run no risk of breaking the rule, I put my left hand in my pocket and held on to my pocket handkerchief all the time the dinner lasted. The singing lasted only a few minutes. During the rest of the time a dead silence reigned amongst us. It was Monday, a fast day, and so the usual absence of noise at meal times had to be observed still more strictly than on any other day. Usually a man who is compelled to break the silence by some emergency or other hastens to plunge into water the middle finger of his left hand, which till then had remained hidden behind his back, and to moisten both his eyelids with it. But a really pious man would not be content with this simple formula of purification. Having spoken, he must leave the dining room, wash thoroughly, and then abstain from food for the remainder of the day. Thanks to this solemn silence, I was at liberty to notice everything that was going on with great attention. Now and again, whenever I caught sight of the Colonel or Mr. Y, I had all the difficulty in the world to preserve my gravity. Fits of foolish laughter would take possession of me when I observed them sitting erect with such comical solemnity and working so awkwardly with their elbows and hands. The long beard of the one was white with grains of rice, as if silvered with hoar frost. The chin of the other was yellow with liquid saffron. But unsatisfied curiosity happily came to my rescue, and I went on watching the quaint proceedings of the Hindus. Each of them, having sat down with his legs twisted under him, poured some water with his left hand out of the jug brought by the servant, first into his cup, then into the palm of his right hand. Then he slowly and carefully sprinkled the water round a dish with all kinds of dainties, which stood by itself and was destined, as we learned afterwards, for the gods. During this procedure each Hindu repeated a Vedic mantra. Filling his right hand with rice, he pronounced a new series of couplets, then, having stored 5 pinches of rice on the right side of his own plate, he once more washed his hands to avert the evil eye, sprinkled more water, and pouring a few drops of it into his right palm, slowly drank it. After this he swallowed 6 pinches of rice, one after the other, murmuring prayers all the while, and wetted both his eyes with the middle finger of his left hand. All this done, he finally hid his left hand behind his back and began eating with the right hand. All this took only a few minutes, but was performed very solemnly. The Hindus ate with their bodies bent over the food, throwing it up and catching it in their mouths so dexterously that not a grain of rice was lost, not a drop of the various liquids spilt. Zealous to show his consideration for his host, the colonel tried to imitate all these movements. He contrived to bend over his food almost horizontally, but, alas, he could not remain long in this position. The natural weight of his powerful limbs overcame him. He lost his balance and nearly tumbled head foremost, dropping his spectacles into a dish of sour milk and garlic. After this unsuccessful experience, the brave American gave up all further attempts to become Hinduized and sat very quietly. The supper was concluded with rice mixed with sugar, powdered peas, olive oil, garlic and grains of pomegranate, as usual. This last dainty is consumed hurriedly. Everyone nervously glances askance at his neighbor and is mortally afraid of being the last to finish, because this is considered a very bad sign. To conclude, they all take some water into their mouths, murmuring prayers the while, and this time they must swallow it in one gulp. Woe to the one who chokes. 'Tis a clear sign that a Buddha has taken possession of his throat. The unfortunate man must run for his life and get purified before the altar. The poor Hindus are very much troubled by these wicked Buddhas, the souls of the people who have died with ungratified desires and earthly passions. Hindu spirits, if I am to believe the unanimous assertions of one and all, are always swarming round the living, always ready to satisfy their hunger with other people's mouths and gratify their impure desires with the help of organs temporarily stolen from the living. They are feared and cursed all over India. No means to get rid of them are despised. The notions and conclusions of the Hindus on this point categorically contradict the aspirations and hopes of Western spiritualists. A good and pure spirit, they are confident, will not let his soul revisit the earth if this soul is equally pure. He is glad to die and unite himself to Brahma, to live an eternal life in Svarga, heaven, and enjoy the society of the beautiful Gandharvas or singing angels. He is glad to slumber whole eternities, listening to their songs, whilst his soul is purified by a new incarnation in a body, which is more perfect than the one the soul abandoned previously. The Hindus believe that the spirit or Atma, a particle of the great All, which is Parabrahm, cannot be punished for sins in which it never participated. It is manas, the animal intelligence, and the animal solar jiva, both half-material illusions, that sin and suffer and transmigrate from one body into the other till they purify themselves. The spirit merely overshadows their earthly transmigrations. When the ego has reached the final state of purity, it will be one with the Atma and gradually will merge and disappear in Parabrahm. But this is not what awaits the wicked souls. The soul that does not succeed in getting rid of earthly cares and desires before the death of the body is weighed down by its sins and, instead of reincarnating in some new form, according to the laws of metempsychosis, it will remain bodiless, doomed to wander on earth. It will become a Buddha, and by its own sufferings will cause unutterable sufferings to its kinsmen. That is why the Hindu fears above all things to remain bodiless after his death. It is better for one to enter the body of a tiger, of a dog, even of a yellow-legged falcon, after death, than to become a Buddha. An old Hindu said to me on one occasion, "Every animal possesses a body of his own, and a right to make an honest use of it. Whereas the Buddhas are doomed dacoits, brigands and thieves, they are ever watching for an opportunity to use what does not belong to them. This is a horrible state, a horror indescribable. This is the true hell." What is this spiritualism they talk so much of in the West? Is it possible the intelligent English and Americans are so mad as this? And all our remonstrances notwithstanding, he refused to believe that there are actually people who are fond of Buddhas, who would do much to attract them into their homes. After supper the men went again to the family well to wash, and then dressed themselves. Usually at this hour of the night the Hindus put on clean malmalas, a kind of tight shirt, white turbans, and wooden sandals with knobs pressed between the toes. These curious shoes are left at the door whilst their owners return to the hall and sit down along the walls on carpets and cushions to chew betel, smoke hookahs and cheroots, to listen to sacred reading, and to witness the dances of the Nauches. But this evening, probably in our honor, all the Hindus dressed magnificently. Some of them wore darias of rich striped satin, no end of gold bangles, necklaces mounted with diamonds and emeralds, gold watches and chains, and transparent Brahmanical scarfs with gold embroidery. The fat fingers and the right ear of our host were simply blazing with diamonds. The women, who waited on us during the meal, disappeared afterwards for a considerable time. When they came back they also were luxuriously overdressed and were introduced to us formally as the ladies of the house. They were 5. The wife of the host, a woman of 26 or 27 years of age, then 2 others looking somewhat younger, one of whom carried a baby and, to our great astonishment, was introduced as the married daughter of the hostess, then the old mother of the host and a little girl of 7, the wife of one of his brothers. So that our hostess turned out to be a grandmother, and her sister-in-law, who was to enter finally into matrimony in from 2 to 3 years, might have become a mother before she was 12. They were all barefooted, with rings on each of their toes, and all, with the exception of the old woman, wore garlands of natural flowers round their necks and in their jet black hair. Their tight bodices, covered with embroidery, were so short that between them and the sari, there was a good quarter of a yard of bare skin. The dark bronze-colored waists of these well-shaped women were boldly presented to anyone's examination and reflected the lights of the room. Their beautiful arms and their ankles were covered with bracelets. At the least of their movements they all set up a tinkling silvery sound, and the little sister-in-law, who might easily be mistaken for an automaton doll, could hardly move under her load of ornaments. The young grandmother, our hostess, had a ring in her left nostril, which reached to the lower part of the chin. Her nose was considerably disfigured by the weight of the gold, and we noticed how unusually handsome she was only when she took it off to enable herself to drink her tea with some comfort. The dances of the Nautch girls began. 2 of them were very pretty. Their dancing consisted chiefly in more or less expressive movements of their eyes, their heads, and even their ears, in fact, of the whole upper part of their bodies. As to their legs, they either did not move at all or moved with such a swiftness as to appear in a cloud of mist. After this eventful day I slept the sleep of the just. After many nights spent in a tent, it is more than agreeable to sleep in a regular bed, even if it is only a hanging one. The pleasure would, no doubt, have been considerably increased had I but known I was resting on the couch of a god. But this latter circumstance was revealed to me only in the morning, when descending the staircase I suddenly discovered the poor General en Chef, Hanuman, deprived of his cradle and unceremoniously stowed away under the stairs. Decidedly, the Hindus of the 19th century are a degenerate and blaspheming race. In the course of the morning we learned that this swinging throne of his, and an ancient sofa, were the only pieces of furniture in the whole house that could be transformed into beds. Neither of our gentlemen had spent a comfortable night. They slept in an empty tower that was once the altar of a decayed pagoda and was situated behind the main building. In assigning to them this strange resting place, the host was guided by the praiseworthy intention of protecting them from the jackals, which freely penetrate into all the rooms of the ground floor, as they are pierced by numberless arches and have no door and no window frames. The jackals, however, did not trouble the gentlemen much that night, except by giving their nightly concert. But both Mr. Y and the Colonel had to fight all the night long with a vampire, which, besides being a flying fox of an unusual size, happened to be a spirit, as we learned too late, to our great misfortune. This is how it happened. Noiselessly hovering about the tower, the vampire from time to time alighted on the sleepers, making them shudder under the disgusting touch of his cold sticky wings. His intention clearly was to get a nice suck of European blood. They were wakened by his manipulations at least 10 times, and each time frightened him away. But, as soon as they were dozing again, the wretched bat was sure to return and perch on their shoulders, heads, or legs. At last Mr. Y, losing patience, had recourse to strong measures. He caught him and broke his neck. Feeling perfectly innocent, the gentleman mentioned the tragic end of the troublesome flying fox to their host, and instantly drew down on their heads all the thunder clouds of heaven. The yard was crowded with people. All the inhabitants of the house stood sorrowfully drooping their heads at the entrance of the tower. Our host's old mother tore her hair in despair and shrieked lamentations in all the languages of India. What was the matter with them all? We were at our wits' end. But when we learned the cause of all this, there was no limit to our confusion. By certain mysterious signs, known only to the family Brahmin, it had been decided 10 years ago that the soul of our host's elder brother had incarnated in this bloodthirsty vampire bat. This fact was stated as being beyond any doubt. For 9 years the late Patera Prabhu existed under this new shape, carrying out the laws of metempsychosis. He spent the hours between sunrise and the sunset in an old pipal tree before the tower, hanging with his head downwards. But at night he visited the old tower and gave fierce chase to the insects that sought rest in this out-of-the-way corner. And so 9 years were spent in this happy existence, divided between sleep, food, and the gradual redemption of old sins committed in the shape of a Patara Prabhu. And now? Now his listless body lay in the dust at the entrance of his favorite tower, and his wings were half devoured by the rats. The poor old woman, his mother, was mad with sorrow and cast, through her tears, reproachful, angry looks at Mr. Y, who, in his new capacity of a heartless murderer, looked disgustingly compassed. But the affair was growing serious. The comical sight of it disappeared before the sincerity and the intensity of her lamentations. Her descendants, grouped around her, were too polite to reproach us openly, but the expression of their faces was far from reassuring. The family priest and astrologer stood by the old lady, shastras in hand, ready to begin the ceremony of purification. He solemnly covered the corpse with a piece of new linen, and so hid from our eyes the sad remains on which ants were literally swarming. Mr. Y did his best to look unconcerned, but still, when the tactless Miss X came to him, expressing her loud indignation at all these superstitions of an inferior race, he at least seemed to remember that our host knew English perfectly, and he did not encourage her farther expressions of sympathy. He made no answer, but smiled contemptuously. Our host approached the colonel with respectful salams and invited us to follow him. No doubt he is going to ask us to leave his house immediately, was my uncomfortable impression. But my apprehension was not justified. At this epoch of my Indian pilgrimage I was far, as yet, from having fathomed the metaphysical depth of a Hindu heart. Sham Rao began by delivering a very far-fetched, eloquent preface. He reminded us that he, personally, was an enlightened man, a man who possessed all the advantages of a Western education. He said that, owing to this, he was not quite sure that the body of the vampire was actually inhabited by his late brother. Darwin, of course, and some other great naturalists of the West, seemed to believe in the transmigration of souls, but, as far as he understood, they believed in it in an inverse sense, that is to say, if a baby had been born to his mother exactly at the moment of the vampire's death, this baby would indubitably have had a great likeness to a vampire, owing to the decaying atoms of the vampire being so close to her. Is not this an exact interpretation of the Darwinian school? He asked. We modestly answered that, having traveled almost incessantly during the last year, we could not help being a bit behindhand in the questions of modern science, and that we were not able to follow its latest conclusions. But I have followed them, rejoined the good-natured Sham Rao, with a touch of pomposity. And so I hope I may be allowed to say that I have understood and duly appreciated their most recent developments. I have just finished studying the magnificent anthropogenesis of Haeckel, and have carefully discussed in my own mind his logical, scientific explanations of the origin of man from inferior animal forms through transformation. And what is this transformation, pray, if not the transmigration of the ancient and modern Hindus, and the metempsychosis of the Greeks? We had nothing to say against the identity, and even ventured to observe that, according to Haeckel, it does look like it. Exactly, exclaimed he joyfully. This shows that our conceptions are neither silly nor superstitious, as is maintained by some opponents of Manu. The great Manu anticipated Darwin and Haeckel. Judge for yourself. The latter derives the genesis of man from a group of plasticides, from the jelly-like monoran, this monoran, through the amyoba, the ascidian, the brainless and heartless amphioxus, and so on, transmigrates in the eighth remove into the lamprey, is transformed, at last, into a vertebrate amniote, into a pre-mammalian, into a marsupial animal. The vampire, in its turn, belongs to the species of vertebrates. You, being well-read people all of you, cannot contradict this statement. He was right in his supposition. We did not contradict it. In this case, do me the honor to follow my argument. We did follow his argument with the greatest attention, but were at a loss to foresee whither it tended to lead us. Darwin, continued Shamrao, in his Origin of Species, re-established almost word for word the palingenetic teachings of our Manu. Of this I am perfectly convinced, and, if you like, I can prove it to you book in hand. Our ancient lawgiver, amongst other sayings, speaks as follows. The great Parabrahm commanded man to appear in the universe, after traversing all the grades of the animal kingdom, and springing primarily from the worm of the deep sea mud. The worm became a snake, the snake a fish, the fish a mammal, and so on. Is not this very idea at the bottom of Darwin's theory, when he maintains that the organic forms have their origin in more simple species, and says that the structureless protoplasm born in the mud of the Laurentian and Silurian periods, the Manu's mud of the seas, I dare say gradually transformed itself into the anthropoid ape, and then finally into the human being? We said it looked very like it. But, in spite of all my respect for Darwin and his eminent follower Haeckel, I cannot agree with their final conclusions, especially with the conclusions of the latter, continued Shamrao. This hasty and bilious German is perfectly accurate in copying the embryology of Manu and all the metamorphoses of our ancestors, but he forgets the evolution of the human soul, which, as it is stated by Manu, goes hand in hand with the evolution of matter. The son of Swayambhuva, the self-becoming, speaks as follows. Everything created in a new cycle, in addition to the qualities of its preceding transmigrations, acquires new qualities, and the nearer it approaches to man, the highest type of the earth, the brighter becomes its divine spark, but, once it has become a Brahma, it will enter the cycle of conscious transmigrations. Do you realize what that means? It means that from this moment, its transformations depend no longer on the blind laws of gradual evolution, but on the least of a man's actions, which brings either a reward or a punishment. Now you see that it depends on the man's will whether, on the one hand, he will start on the way to moksha, the eternal bliss, passing from one loka to another till he reaches Brahmaloka, or, on the other, owing to his sins, will be thrown back. You know that the average soul, once freed from earthly reincarnations, has to ascend from one loka to another, always in the human shape, though this shape will grow and perfect itself with every loka. Some of our sects understood these lokas to mean certain stars. These spirits, freed from earthly matter, are what we mean by Pitras and Devas, whom we worship. And did not your Kabbalists of the Middle Ages designate these Pitras under the expression planetary spirits? But, in the case of a very sinful man, he will have to begin once more with the animal forms which he had already traversed unconsciously. Both Darwin and Haeckel lose sight of this, so to speak, second volume of their incomplete theory, But still neither of them advances any argument to prove it false. Is it not so? Neither of them does anything of the sort, most assuredly. Why, in this case, exclaimed he, suddenly changing his colloquial tone for an aggressive one, why am I who have studied the most modern ideas of Western science, I who believe in its representatives, why am I suspected, pray, by Miss X of belonging to the tribe of the ignorant and superstitious Hindus? Why does she think that our perfected scientific theories are superstitions? And we ourselves a fallen inferior race? Sham Rao stood before us with tears in his eyes. We were at a loss what to answer him, being confused to the last degree by this outburst. Mind you, I do not proclaim our popular beliefs to be infallible dogmas. I consider them as mere theories and try to the best of my ability to reconcile the ancient and the modern science. I formulate hypotheses just like Darwin and Haeckel. Besides, if I understood rightly, Miss X is a spiritualist, so she believes in Buddhas. And, believing that a Buddha is capable of penetrating the body of a medium, how can she deny that a Buddha, and more so a less sinful soul, may enter the body of a vampire bat? I own, this logic was a little too condensed for us, and so, avoiding a direct answer to a metaphysical question of such delicacy, we tried to apologize and excuse Miss X's rudeness as well as we could. She did not mean to offend you, we said, she only repeated a calumny, familiar to every European. Besides, if she had taken the trouble to think it over, she probably would not have said it. Little by little we succeeded in pacifying our host. He recovered his usual cheerfulness, but could not resist the temptation of adding a few words to his long argumentation. He had just begun to reveal to us certain peculiarities of his late brother's character, which induced him to be prepared, judging by the laws of atavism, to see their repetition in the propensities of a vampire bat, when Mr. Y suddenly dashed in on our small group and spoiled all the results of our conciliatory words by screaming at the top of his voice. The old woman has gone demented. She keeps on cursing us and says that the murder of this wretched bat is only the forerunner of a whole series of misfortunes brought on her house by you, Sham Rao, said he, hastily addressing the bewildered follower of Haeckel. She says you have polluted your Brahmanical holiness by inviting us. Colonel, you had better send for the elephants. In another moment all this crowd will be on us, for goodness' sake. Exclaimed poor Sham Rao, have some consideration for my feelings. She is an old woman, she has some superstitions, but she is my mother. You are educated people, learned people, advise me, show me a way out of all these difficulties. What should you do in my place? What should I do, sir? Exclaimed Mr. Y, completely put out of temper by the utter ludicrousness of our awkward predicament. What should I do? Were I a man in your position and a believer in all you are brought up to believe, I should take my revolver and, in the first place, shoot all the vampire bats in the neighborhood, if only to rid all your late relations from the abject bodies of these creatures, and, in the second place, I should endeavor to smash the head of the conceited fraud in the shape of a Brahmin who invented all this stupid story. That is what I should do, sir. But this advice did not content the miserable descendant of Rama. No doubt he would have remained a long time undecided as to what course of action to adopt, torn as he was between the sacred feelings of hospitality, the innate fear of the Brahmin priest, and his own superstitions, if our ingenious Babu had not come to our rescue. Learning that we all felt more or less indignant of all this row, and that we were preparing to leave the house as quickly as possible, he persuaded us to stay, if only for an hour, saying that our hasty departure would be a terrible outrage upon our host, whom, in any case, we could not find fault with. As to the stupid old woman, the babu promised us to pacify her speedily enough. He had his own plans and views. In the meantime, he said, we had better go and examine the ruins of an old fortress close by. We obeyed very reluctantly, feeling an acute interest in his plans. We proceeded slowly. Our gentlemen were visibly out of temper. Miss X tried to calm herself by talking more than usual, and Narayan, as phlegmatic as usual, indolently and good-naturedly chaffed her about her beloved spirits. Glancing back, we saw the babu accompanied by the family priest. Judging by their gestures, they were engaged in some warm discussion. The shaven head of the Brahmin nodded right and left, his yellow garment flapped in the wind, and his arms rose towards the sky, as if in an appeal to the gods to come down and testify to the truth of his words. I'll bet you $1,000, no plans of our babus will be of any avail with this fanatic, confidently remarked the colonel as he lit his pipe. But we had hardly walked 100 steps after this remark when we saw the babu running after us and signaling us to stop. Everything ended first rate, screamed he, as soon as we could hear. You are to be thanked. You happen to be the true saviors and benefactors of the deceased Buddha. Our babu sank on the ground, holding his narrow, panting breast with both his hands, and laughed till we all burst into laughter too, before learning anything at all. Think of it, began the babu, and stopped short, prevented from going on by his exuberant hilarity. Just think of it. The whole transaction is to cost me only 10 rupees. I offered 5 at first, but he would not. He said this was a sacred matter, but 10 he could not resist. Ho, 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 at last we learned the story. All the metempsychosis depend on the imagination of the family gurus, who receive for their kind offices from 100 to 150 rupees a year. Every rite is accompanied by a more or less considerable addition to the purse of the insatiable family Brahmin, but the happy events pay better than the sad ones. Knowing all this, the babu asked the Brahmin point blank to perform a false samadhi, that is to say, to feign an inspiration, and to announce to the sorrowing mother that her late son's will had acted consciously in all the circumstances, that he brought about his end in the body of the flying fox, that he was tired of that grade of transmigration, that he longed for death in order to attain a higher position in the animal kingdom, that he is happy, and that he is deeply indebted to the sahib who broke his neck and so freed him from his abject embodiment. Besides, the observant eye of our all-knowing babu had not failed to remark that a she-buffalo of the guru's was expecting a calf, and that the guru was yearning to sell it to Sham Rao. This circumstance was a trump card in the babu's hand. Let the guru announce, under the influence of samadhi, that the freed spirit intends to inhabit the body of the future baby buffalo, and the old lady will buy the new incarnation of her firstborn, as sure as the sun is bright. This announcement will be followed by rejoicings and by new rites. And who will profit by all this if not the family priest? At first the guru had some misgivings, and swore by everything sacred that the vampire bat was veritably inhabited by the brother of Sham Rao. But the babu knew better than to give in. The guru ended by understanding that his skillful opponents saw through his tricks and that he was well aware that the Shastras exclude the possibility of such a transmigration. Growing alarmed, the guru also grew meek and asked only 10 rupees and a promise of silence for the performance of a samadhi. On our way back we were met at the gate by Sham Rao, who was simply radiant. Whether he was afraid of our laughing at him or was at loss to find an explanation of this new metamorphosis in the positive sciences in general, and Haeckel in particular, he did not attempt to explain why the affair had taken such an unexpectedly good turn. He merely mentioned awkwardly enough that his mother, owing to some new mysterious conjectures of hers, had dismissed all sad apprehensions as to the destiny of her elder son, and he then dropped the subject completely. In order to wipe away the traces of the morning's perplexities from our minds, Sham Rao invited us to sit on the veranda by the white entrance of his idol room whilst the family prayers were going on. Nothing could suit us better. It was 9 o'clock, the usual time of the morning prayers. Sham Rao went to the well to get ready and dress himself, as he said, though the process was more like undressing. In a few moments he came back wearing only a dhoti, as during dinner time, and with his head uncovered. He went straight to his idol room. The moment he entered we heard the loud stroke of a bell that hung under the ceiling and that continued tolling all the time the prayers lasted. The Babu explained to us that a little boy was pulling the bell rope from the roof. Sham Rao stepped in with his right foot and very slowly. Then he approached the altar and sat on a little stool with his legs crossed. At the opposite side of the room, on the red velvet shelves of an altar that resembled an etagere in the drawing room of some fashionable lady, stood many idols. They were made of gold, of silver, of brass and of marble, according to their importance and merits. Mahadeva or Shiva was of gold, Ganpati or Ganesha of silver, Vishnu in the form of a round black stone from the river Gandaki in Nepal. In this form Vishnu is called Lakshmi Narayan. There were also many other gods unknown to us, who were worshipped in the shapes of big seashells, called chakra. Surya, the god of the sun, and the Kula Devas, the domestic gods, were placed in the second rank. The altar was sheltered by a cupola of carved sandal wood. During the night the gods and the offerings were covered by a huge bell glass. On the walls there were many sacred images representing the chief episodes in the biographies of the higher gods. Sham Rao filled his left hand with ashes, murmuring prayers all the while, covered it for a second with the right one, then put some madder to the ashes, and mixing the two by rubbing his hands together, he traced a line on his face with this mixture by moving the thumb of his right hand from his nose upwards, then from the middle of the forehead to the right temple, then back again to the left temple. Having done with his face he proceeded to cover with wet ashes his throat, arms, shoulders, his back, head and ears. In one corner of the room stood a huge bronze font filled with water. Sham Rao made straight to it and plunged into it 3 times, duty, head and all, after which he came out looking exactly like a well-favored dripping wet triton. He twisted the only lock of hair on the top of his shaved head and sprinkled it with water. This operation concluded the first act. The second act began with religious meditations and with mantrams, which, by really pious people, must be repeated 3 times a day at sunrise, at noon and at sunset. Sham Rao loudly pronounced the names of 24 gods, and each name was accompanied by a stroke of the bell. Having finished, he first shut his eyes and stuffed his ears with cotton, then pressed his left nostril with 2 fingers of his left hand, and having filled his lungs with air through the right nostril, pressed the latter also. Then he tightly closed his lips so that breathing became impossible. In this position, every pious Hindu must mentally repeat a certain verse, which is called the Gayatri. These are sacred words which no Hindu will dare to pronounce aloud. Even in repeating them mentally, he must take every precaution not to inhale anything impure. I am bound by my word of honor never to repeat the whole of this prayer, but I may quote a few unconnected sentences. Earth, heaven, let the adored light of here follows a name which must not be pronounced, shelter me. Let thy Son, O thou only one, shelter me. The unworthy, I shut my eyes, I shut my ears, I do not breathe in order to see, hear and breathe thee alone. Throw light upon our thoughts again, the secret name. It is curious to compare this Hindu prayer with the celebrated prayer of Descartes' Meditation 3 in his L'existence de Dieu. It runs as follows, if I remember rightly. Now I shut my eyes, cover my ears, and dismiss all my 5 senses. I will dwell on the thought of God alone. I will meditate on His quality and look on the beauty of this wondrous radiancy. After this prayer, Sham Rao read many other prayers, holding with 2 fingers his sacred Brahmanical thread. After a while began the ceremony of the washing of the gods. Taking them down from the altar, one after the other, according to their rank, Sham Rao first plunged them in the big font, in which he had just bathed himself, and then bathed them in milk in a smaller bronze font by the altar. The milk was mixed up with curds, butter, honey, and sugar, and so it cannot be said that this cleansing served its purpose. No wonder we were glad to see that the gods underwent a second bathing in the first font, and then were dried with a clean towel. When the gods were arranged in their respective places, the Hindu traced on them the sectarian signs with a ring from his left hand. He used white sandal paint for the lingam and red for Ganpati and Surya. Then he sprinkled them with aromatic oils and covered them with fresh flowers. The long ceremony was finished by the awakening of the gods. A small bell was repeatedly rung under the noses of the idols, who, as the Brahmin probably supposed, all went to sleep during this tedious ceremony. Having noticed, or fancied, which often amounts to the same thing, that they were wide awake, he began offering them his daily sacrifices, lighting the incense and the lamps, and, to our great astonishment, snapping his fingers from time to time, as if warning the idols to look out. Having filled the room with clouds of incense and fumes of burning camphor, he scattered some more flowers over the altar and sat on the small stool for a while, murmuring the last prayers. He repeatedly held the palms of his hands over the flame of the tapers and rubbed his face with them. Then he walked round the altar 3 times and, having knelt 3 times, retreated backwards to the door. A little while before our host had finished his morning prayers, the ladies of the house came into the room. They brought each a small stool and sat in a row murmuring prayers and telling the beads of their rosaries. The part played by the rosaries in India is as important as in all Buddhist countries. Every god has his favorite flower and his favorite material for a rosary. The fakirs are simply covered with rosaries. The rosary is called mala and consists of 108 beads. Very pious Hindus are not content to tell the beads when praying. They must hide their hands during this ceremony in a bag called gamukha, which means the cow's mouth. We left the women to their prayers and followed our host to the cow house. The cow symbolizes the fostering earth, or nature, and is worshipped accordingly. Shamrao sat down by the cow and washed her feet, first with her own milk, then with water. He gave her some sugar and rice, covered her forehead with powdered sandal, and adorned her horns and forelegs with chains of flowers. He burned some incense under her nostrils and brandished a burning lamp over her head. Then he walked 3 times round her and sat down to rest. Some Hindus walk round the cow 108 times, rosary in hand. But our Shamrao had a slight tendency to free thinking, as we knew, and besides, he was too much of an admirer of Heckle. Having rested himself, he filled a cup with water, put it at the cow's tail for a moment, and then drank it. After this he performed the rite of worshipping the sun and the sacred plant Tulsi. Unable to bring the god Surya from his heavenly altar and wash him in the sacred font, Shamrao contented himself by filling his own mouth with water, standing on one leg, and spurting this water towards the sun. Needless to say, it never reached the orb of day, but, very unexpectedly, sprinkled us instead. It is still a mystery to us why the plant Tulsi, royal basilicum, is worshipped. However, towards the end of September we yearly witnessed a strange ceremony of the wedding of this plant with the god Vishnu, notwithstanding that Tulsi bears the title of Krishna's bride, probably because of the latter being an incarnation of Vishnu. On these occasions pots of this plant are painted and adorned with tinsel. A magical circle is traced in the garden, and the plant is put in the middle of it. The Brahmin brings an idol of Vishnu and begins the marriage ceremony, standing before the plant. A married couple hold a shawl between the plant and the god, as if screening them from each other. The Brahmin utters prayers, and young women, and especially unmarried girls, who are the most ardent worshippers of Tulsi, throw rice and saffron over the idol and the plant. When the ceremony is concluded, the Brahmin is presented with the shawl, the idol is put in the shade of his wife, the Hindus clap their hands, rend everyone's ears with the noise of tom-toms, let off fireworks, offer each other pieces of sugar cane, and rejoice in every conceivable way till the dawn of the next day. And that's not all. Our experts and regular viewers respond to all comments. Also check if you forgot to subscribe and set your bell to receive notifications about new audiobooks and other useful self-development materials that we release regularly. Join in the discussions, don't forget to give likes and, if possible and inspired, support the development of the channel financially. All useful links will be in the description and the first attached comment. Goodness, love and wisdom to all. And now move on to watch the next part of the video at the links below, or choose something from the playlists of the channel and those you see on the screen.